Hi everyone, and welcome to The Handy Philosopher. We're continuing on with part three of our Singer reading. So this will cover paragraphs 14 to 23 in the reading, if you've got the copy of the book that I've provided. So in this section, we're going to see Singer dealing with two major objections that he anticipates to his theory. And his reply to both of these objections. So if you remember, in the last section, Singer really laid out the logical argument for why it's not optional, why we ought morally to give to charities, not could, but ought. It's an imperative that we do it. And so now that that has been established, then he's going to be looking at, well, what are some things that people might say in response to this? Okay. The first little bit that we'll look at will introduce the severity of the change that Singer is advocating for, and then the two objections that we'll look at are that the moral restructure is too extreme or too drastic, and that we should be trying to maximize happiness, not reduce suffering. So Singer will sort of square away both of these, but it's up to you whether you find those answers to be compelling. So let's get started. 14 to 16 is just sort of a little bit of an intro into this next section, but Singer does point out how extreme, he points out that he does realize how extreme his views are. The outcome of this argument is that our traditional moral categories are upset. The traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. Giving money to the Bengal Refugee Fund is regarded as an act of charity in our society. The bodies which collect the money are known as charities. These organizations see themselves in this way. If you send them a check, you will be thanked for your generosity, because giving money is regarded as an act of charity. It is not thought that there is anything wrong with not giving. Okay, so this is an important thing that we need to identify, and this distinction between duty and charity is important. In our society at the moment, there are certain things that you have a duty to do morally. For example, we see that we have a duty not to steal from other people. That if we were to take part in this, we would be a bad person. We have a duty not to kill other people, at least innocent people. If we were to take part in this, then we would be seen as a bad person. Then there are all of these like optional extras. They're like moral boosters. So if I donate money to charity, this actually takes me beyond what is maybe a normal level of morality, and I'm now extra moral. And so this is not seen to be a duty. This is now an option. If we accept Singer's argument, this no longer becomes optional. In the same way that you are obliged not to steal, you are also obliged to donate money. And in the same way that if you decide to steal, you are a bad person. Should you decide not to donate money, you are a bad person. Okay, confronting, but remember, we're looking at the logical analysis of this. So if you can find an error, let me know. So the charitable man may be praised, but the man who is not charitable is not condemned. People do not feel in any way ashamed or guilty about spending money on new clothes or a new car instead of giving to famine relief. Indeed, the alternative does not occur to them. This way of looking at the matter cannot be justified. So Singer is very clear about this. We are talking about saving a life. So if you cannot justify buying a new pair of clothes, or a new set of clothes, over saving someone's life. And if you can, well, then you need to go back to the previous recording and look at the argument about moral significance. Are you really saying that a set of clothing is morally significant to a life? If so, fine, but Singer does not agree with your view, and he's claiming that the vast majority of people would not agree with it either. When we buy new clothes, not to keep ourselves warm, but to look well dressed. We are not providing for any important need. We would not be sacrificing anything significant if we were to continue to wear our old clothes and give the money to famine relief. By doing so, we would be preventing another person from starving. It follows from what I have said earlier that we ought to give money away, rather than spend it on clothes which we do not need to keep us warm. To do so is not charitable or generous, nor is it kind the kind of act which philosophers and theologians have called supererogatory. I was always going to struggle with that, which is an act which it would be good to do, but not wrong not to do. On the contrary, we ought to give the money away, and it is wrong not to do so. So, Singer is saying we need to change our moral categorization of society. We can no longer say that if you are not doing anything bad, you are a good person. If you are not fulfilling your duties, you are a bad person, and we now need to include giving to charity as part of duty. It's not an option. So if you do not do that, you are a bad person in the same way that you are a bad person if you steal or murder. Okay? This might sound extreme, but remember, we're talking about lives, saving lives. Okay? I am not maintaining that there are no acts which are charitable, or that there are no acts which it would be good to do but not wrong not to do. It may be possible to redraw the distinction between duty and charity in some other place. All I am arguing here is that the present way of drawing the distinction, which makes it an act of charity for a man living at the level of affluence which most people in the developed nations enjoy, to give money to save someone else from starvation, cannot be supported. It is beyond the scope of my argument to consider whether the distinction should be redrawn or abolished altogether. There would be many other possible ways of drawing the distinction. For instance, one might decide that it is good to make other people as happy as possible, but not wrong not to do so. So Singer's saying, like, well, what should count as going above and beyond now? What would we call a charitable person if it's not going to be someone who gives money to charity? Like, if that is a moral obligation, then we're not charitable. We're not going above and beyond. Singer's saying that that's not really part of the argument at the moment. All that he's saying is the current definition of charitable cannot exist if you agree with his argument. Okay. Um, So 16, last part for this slide. Despite the limited nature of the revision of our moral conceptual scheme which I am proposing, the revision would, given the extent of both affluence and famine in the world today, have radical implications. These implications may lead to further objections, distinct from those I have already considered. I shall discuss two of these. So Singer's introducing the idea that there are two objections that he's going to be looking at. But he does say to begin with that whilst this redefining of charity might sound like a relatively minor thing, it would cause a fundamental shift to our moral reasoning. Because if I'm no longer a neutral person for not giving to charity, if I am now a bad person for not giving to charity, if I am immoral, this is not the way society thinks at the moment. And there's going to be a hell of a lot of immoral people. Okay. So next part. So this is now 17 to 19 with the first objection that Singer's looking at, which is that this change is simply too extreme, too drastic. One objection to the position I have taken might be simply that it is too drastic a revision of our moral scheme. People do not ordinarily judge in the way I have suggested they should. Most people reserve their moral condemnation for those who violate some moral norm, such as the norm against taking another person's property. They do not condemn those who indulge a luxury instead of giving to famine relief. But given that I did not set out to present a morally neutral description of the way people make moral judgments, the way people do in fact judge has nothing to do with the validity of my conclusion. So Singer is saying here, just because it's hard doesn't make it wrong. Okay. Just because most people reserve the sort of bad person tag to people who break moral rules doesn't mean that the conclusion that Singer is identifying is incorrect. And again, if you go back and look at it, where is he making an error in logic or truth? If you can find it, tell me. But he's claiming that there is none. My conclusion follows from the principle which I advanced earlier, sorry, and unless that principle is rejected or the arguments are shown to be unsound, I think the conclusion must stand, however strange it appears. It might nevertheless be interesting to consider why our society and most other societies do judge differently from the way I have suggested they should. In a well-known article, J. O. Ormston suggests that the imperatives of duty which tell us what we must do, as distinct from what it would be good to do but not wrong not to do, function so as to prohibit behavior that is intolerable if men are to live together in society. This may explain the origin and continued existence of the present division between acts of duty and acts of charity. Moral attitudes are shaped by the needs of society, and no doubt society needs people who will observe the rules that make social existence tolerable. From the point of view of a particular society, it is essential to prevent violations of norms against killing, stealing, and so on. It is quite inessential, however, to help people outside of one's own society. So Singer identifies this objection as potentially, at least, coming from the idea that the purpose, the utility, the function that morals serve is to act as almost like a social lubricant, to make living in society run smoother, to be more palatable to live around other people. If we have these agreed upon rules, then I know how you're going to treat me and how you know how I'm going to treat you, and we can expect that everyone will follow those rules and will come down hard on people who don't, because they're really making it hard to live in a society. But if I'm talking about people who don't live in my society, then really these rules don't apply to them anyway. Okay, because I haven't written the law that it is wrong to steal for someone who's on the other side of the world from me, because they couldn't steal my stuff even if they wanted to. Okay, the law it is wrong to steal is really for only for people who have the ability to steal from me, so are within my society, within my proximity, and so now these moral rules and obligations do apply to them. Okay, but once they're outside my society, moral rules and obligations don't apply to people. And so I'm not actually obliged to help anyone outside my society, because then morality is no longer serving its function of making societies a better place to live in, essentially. Okay, so uh, hopefully that's clear. Singer's now going to deal with this. If this is an explanation of our common distinction between duty and supererogatory, you know what I'm trying to say, supererogation. However, it is not a justification of it. The moral point of view requires us to look beyond the interests of our own society. Previously, I have already mentioned this may hardly have been feasible. But it is quite feasible now. Uh, from the moral point of view, the prevention of the starvation of millions of people outside our society must be considered at least as pressing as the upholding of property norms within our society. So if you remember in the previous recording or section of the reading, Singer referred to the idea of the global village. Because of technological advancements, everyone is now within the proximity of my society. And if this sounds ludicrous, and if we go back to the idea of, well, someone on the other side of the world can't steal from me, actually now they can. If you've ever gotten one of those emails from the Nigerian prince who's asking for your bank details, you would see that you can be robbed from the other side of the world. And so this global village now means that moral codes don't just apply to people who are within our physical proximity, they apply to people everywhere. because everyone is in our technological proximity. Okay, so morality has now extended far beyond our nation's borders or our society's borders. Okay, it has been argued by some writers, among them Sidgwick and Urmson, that we need to have a basic moral code which is not too far beyond the capacities of the ordinary man, for otherwise there will be general breakdown of compliance with the moral code. Crudely stated, this argument suggests that if we tell people that they ought to refrain from murder and give everything they do uh, sorry, and give everything they do not really need to famine relief, they will do neither. Whereas if we tell them that they ought to refrain from murder and that it is good to give to famine relief, but not wrong not to do so, they will at least refrain from murder. The issue here is, where should we draw the line between conduct that is required and conduct that is good, although not required, so as to get the best possible results? Okay, so Singer's basically saying here another objection that's been raised by others in the past is that if we have moral rules that are too demanding, then people won't follow them. And if they're not going to follow one, they're much more likely not to follow all of the others. So if we say to people, you're not allowed to kill people, and you also have to give up any extra funds you have to help people in extreme poverty. And basically, Singer's saying that the suggestion is their response will be, what? I have to give up all of the extra money I've got to charity. Well, I'm not going to do any of it, and then just go out and start killing people. Okay. Um, Singer doesn't think this is very likely, but let's continue. The issue here is, so we've already read that. Where should we draw the line? This would seem to be an empirical question, although a very difficult one. One objection to the Sidgwick Urmson line of argument is that it takes insufficient account of the effect that moral standards can have on the decisions we make. Given a society in which a wealthy man who gives 5% of his income to famine relief is regarded as most generous, it is not surprising that a proposal that we all ought to give away half our incomes will be thought to be absurdly unrealistic. In a society which held that no man should have more than enough while others have less than they need, such a proposal might seem narrow-minded. What it is possible for a man to do and what he is likely to do are both, I think, very greatly influenced by what people around him are doing and expecting him to do. So Singer's saying here that we need to understand the power of things like peer pressure. Um, uh, we need to understand that people would be much more likely to give to charity if it was expected of them. If other people in society just did it like as a matter of course, in the same way that the vast majority of people in society don't steal, we don't look at someone who doesn't steal and go, "Wow, you're such a good person. You know, you don't steal. My goodness, what a moral beacon you are for all of us." Singer's saying, if we have that same level for giving to charity, then that will become the norm in the same way that not stealing is normal. It's not going above and beyond. Okay. And that this will create basically like a social pressure where what becomes a standard moral behavior has changed and now encompasses giving to charity. In any case, the possibility that by spreading the idea that we ought to be doing very much more than we are to relieve famine, we shall bring about a general breakdown of moral behavior seems remote. So Singer doesn't think it's likely that just because if we say that people have to give to charity, then they won't and therefore won't follow any other moral rules and people will be killed in the streets. He doesn't think that's very likely. If the stakes are an end to widespread starvation, it is worth the risk. So we have to remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to save millions of lives. And if this is the biggest risk we need to take, an unlikely breakdown of moral behavior, Singer thinks that it's a risk well worth taking. Finally, it should be emphasized that these conditions are relevant only to the issue of what we should require from others, and not to what we ourselves ought to do. So this is really only relevant for the rule we're going to put into society, not what we ourselves expect ourselves to do. Okay? So That was objection number one. The moral restructure is too drastic. Um, Singer's response is firstly, it is very drastic, but that doesn't make it wrong. And then secondly, that if it would lead to a breakdown in morality, Singer sees this as a very, very slim chance, but considering we're talking about saving millions of lives, this is probably a chance worth taking. Okay. The last part for this recording, paragraphs 20 to 23, the second objection here is the idea that, well, isn't utilitarianism also about promoting happiness or pleasure? And what about that? Okay. The second objection to my attack on the present distinction between duty and charity is one which has from time to time been made against utilitarianism. It follows from some forms of utilitarian theory that we all ought morally to be working full time to increase the balance of happiness over misery. The position I have taken here would not lead to this conclusion in all circumstances, for if there were no bad occurrences that we could prevent without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, my arguments would have no application. Given the present conditions in many parts of the world, however, it does follow from my argument that we ought morally to be working full time to relieve great suffering of the sort that occurs as a result of famine and other disasters. Um, so this is, some people would say, okay, well, yeah, I could use this money to donate to charity, but how much happiness am I going to be promoting there? I mean, I'm really just prolonging the life of someone living in extreme poverty. Is this, am I really doing something that's going to make people happy? If I spend this money on myself, um, then it's going to make me happy. Like I'm actually going to be producing a positive instead of just prolonging a negative. Um, Singer doesn't really buy into this because uh, he sees the far more important duty that we have is to relieve great suffering. Um, okay, and this argument might work better if we could say that poverty was endless, but Singer at least, and it's worth noting, lots of organizations around the world are breaking this myth that poverty is limitless. It's not limitless. It could be ended. And keep in mind that through the Millennium Development Goals, global poverty has been cut in half since the turn of the century, which sounds like a small thing, but that's a huge achievement. Okay. There's nothing to say that in the next 20 years we won't be able to actually have no one in the world living in extreme poverty. It's entirely possible. So, yeah, then we can worry about maximizing happiness. But while we've got great suffering, like that of famine, this should really be our main concern. Of course, mitigating circumstances can be adduced. For instance, that if we were wear ourselves out through overwork, we shall be less effective than we would otherwise have been. Nevertheless, when all considerations of this sort have been taken into account, the conclusion remains. We ought to be preventing as much suffering as we can without sacrificing something else of comparable moral importance. This conclusion is one which we may be reluctant to face. I cannot see, though, why it should be regarded as a criticism of the position for which I have argued, rather than a criticism of our ordinary standards of behavior. Since most people are self-interested to some degree, very few of us are likely to do everything that we ought to do. It would, however, hardly be honest to take this as evidence that it is not the case that we ought to do it. So in this first paragraph of this section, Singer's really, going back to this idea of just because it's hard doesn't mean that it's not our moral obligation. When we've got people living in great suffering, the question is not how can I maximize happiness? The question is, am I having to sacrifice something of equal moral worth to reduce that suffering? When we're talking about life, am I sacrificing life to save a life? If the answer is yes, then I'm not obliged to do that. I don't have to do that. But if the answer is no, I really do. And so Singer doesn't really buy into this idea of trying to maximize happiness in the world because we can solve global poverty. It is possible. Continuing on, it may be thought that my conclusions are wildly out of line with what everyone else thinks that and has always thought that there must be something wrong with the argument somewhere. In order to show that my conclusions, while certainly contrary to contemporary Western moral standards, would not have seemed so extraordinary at other times and in other places, I would like to quote a passage from a writer not normally thought of as a way out radical, Thomas Aquinas. So here, Singer is pointing to Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher, to show that his ideas are not radical and new. This is not something that is fundamentally opposed to all human societies. In fact, it's something that was argued for, you know, 700 years ago, or close to 800 years ago. So here's the quote from Aquinas. Now, according to the natural order instituted by divine providence, material goods are provided for the satisfaction of human needs. So it's worth noting Thomas Aquinas was a Catholic philosopher. So by divine providence, he's talking about the will of God. Whether you believe in God or not doesn't really change the what Singer's using this argument for, which is to show that the idea that we should be doing more for people in extreme need has been around for a long time. So try not to get hung up on the God references, any atheists out there. It works perfectly without taking God into consideration, which is what Singer's argument does. At no point does he reference divine will. Okay. Therefore, the division and appropriation of property which proceeds from human law must not hinder the satisfaction of man's necessity from such good. Equally, whatever a man has in superabundance is owed of natural right to the poor for their sustenance. So that line there, whatever a man has in superabundance is owed of natural right to the poor for their sustenance. Aquinas here is saying exactly what Singer's saying. If you have more than you need, and there's people who have less than you need, then you owe those people that extra stuff. That's actually their stuff. And I think I've said before, but if we imagine clothing everyone in the world, let's imagine that we've got this huge pile of clothes and everyone gets an opportunity to take a set of clothes. And now you go up and take a second set. Well, and you're like, well, they were sitting there, so, everyone else has got some. Okay, fine. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about there's this big set of clothes. You've gone and gotten several outfits, which has left other people without clothes. Okay, the clothes that you've taken, the extra clothes that you've taken are actually those people. They were put there for those people. You haven't taken excess stuff. You've actually taken stuff away from other people. So Ambrosius says, and it is also to be found in the Decretum Gratiani, the bread which you withhold belongs to the hungry, the clothing you shut away to the naked, and the money you bury in the earth is the redemption and freedom of the penniless. In other words, the food you've got left over at the end of a meal is actually the property of the hungry. The clothes that you have in your closet that you never wear is actually the property of those who don't have clothes. The money that you don't spend and you squirrel away is actually the property of those who don't have any money. So this, seeing as this was written, as I said, almost 800 years ago, it should stand as evidence that this is not a new idea. I now want to consider a number of points, more practical than philosophical, which are relevant to the application of the moral conclusion we have reached. These points challenge not the idea that we ought to be doing all we can to prevent starvation, but the idea that by giving away a great deal of money is the best means to end this. So the next section will be looking at the idea that is donating money really the way to solve this problem? Okay, and if it is, who is the entity that's obliged to do that? Is it individuals? Is it governments? So we'll see this coming from Singer in the next section. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully it's been clear. If you've got any questions, let me know. But otherwise, see you next time. Have a great day.